Hi everyone, welcome to the next webinar in BenchPrep HR's fall webinar series. The webinar today is on risk management. My name is Katie and I'm a Customer Success Manager at BenchPrep. If you are currently participating in the webinar and can hear me, can you please use the chat feature within the system and type yes so that I know that the audio is working on all sides? All right, that is awesome news. Thank you so much, everyone. So again, my name is Katie and I work here on the BenchPrep team. This presentation is being recorded and the recording as well as the slides that we use today will be available within the course by the end of the day today. So to find the recording of this webinar or the recording of any previous webinar that we've had, you'll go to the lessons section of the course, scroll to the bottom of the table of contents, and you'll see a section called webinars. Under this, you'll find the dates of every webinar, and within those lessons, the recordings and slides from every webinar. So I will be here at the beginning and end of the webinar to introduce John Newton, who is our host today. At the end, I'll be here to answer any product questions you may have about the BenchPrep HR learning system. So I can answer questions about the technology, if you're having issues with the mobile app, if you just have any questions about the product in general, I can help you with those. John, who is our resident HR expert, will walk you through the content side of things with the topic today of risk management. So once John starts, he'll go over the content, and then at the end, he will have 10 minutes for content-specific questions, and then I will have 5 minutes for product-specific questions. So a quick reminder before we get started, I will show this again at the end of the presentation, but please remember that we have 4 more webinars after this one today in our series, and you can sign up for them at benchprep.clickmeeting.com, or you can go to a lesson within the learning system called Sign Up for Our Next Webinar, which, just like the recordings, is in the lesson section of the course at the bottom of the page. You can also join BenchPrep on social media to receive updates and interact with other professionals who are using the learning system. So we have a BenchPrep HR group on LinkedIn. You can also follow us on Twitter or like us on Facebook. So to find any of these accounts, you'll just search BenchPrep HR on that platform, and you'll see our page momentarily. As always, I am very excited to introduce you all to John Newton today. He is our HR expert. He is wonderful. He holds the SPHR certification, and he's also a consultant with his own HR company, which is John Newton & Associates, and that company covers a range of industries. In addition to working with us, John also teaches PHR and SPHR prep at the university level at both DePaul University in Chicago and Northern Illinois University. So a few things to note before I hand things off to John. John will use the chat feature to ask your opinion on things or to ask you to answer questions for him. If you have specific questions on the content, please wait and use the designated Q&A time for those questions. It can get distracting if we have people asking questions at the same time that John is prompting you to use the chat feature. So that's all that I have for you. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to John. Give us a few seconds, and there may be a little bit of a pause in the audio, but we will get things started. All yours, John.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Katie. This is John Newton. If you can all hear me, if you go ahead and put a hello or a hi or a thumbs up or something so I just know, fantastic. Great. All right, well, we're going to go right on to our materials here and risk management. First of all, I congratulate you as this is our final functional area. So you've made it through the 6 functional areas. It really is the smallest as far as test-worthy content, but still important to all of us, and so we want to spend some time talking about that. As you're going through today's session. If you've got some general questions on your certification exam or some final prep that you might want to be doing, feel free to get ready at the end to type those in. I'll try and address those as well. We do have one more webinar that we're offering in a couple weeks where we'll come back and recap after the additional webinars that some other folks will be hosting for bench prep, other HR professionals, and then we'll come back in a couple weeks and look at just kind of any open questions you have. But rather than just wait till then, if you've got some general, how do I prep for the certification exam or any tips that you want to know, feel free to have those ready as well. So as we dive into risk today, folks, I think the first thing that is important for all of us to remember is that when you think about risk, it isn't always bad risk. And I think that's important when you're answering test questions is, well, we talk about risk and we talk about safety, and it really is managing risk and what is the kind of risk that we're willing to take on, and what is the risk that we want to avoid at all costs and things like that. So just make sure when you're answering test questions that you don't always go eliminate, 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 because sometimes a certain amount of risk would be acceptable when doing business. This first sort of content slide talks to us about some overall concepts of the functional area, and it points out that there is the Occupational Safety and Health Act, as well as the administration that oversees the act. This is a federal body and a federal law that fundamentally looks at this concept of general duty clause. And what that means for us folks is, as employers, it is our general duty, it is our responsibility to do everything we can to keep our people safe. So when I talked a minute ago about acceptable risk isn't necessarily, well, as long as one person dies and not 100, we're okay with that. That's really not what we're talking about, right? But fundamentally, we are responsible for doing everything possible to keep our people safe. When we talk about identifying risks and so we can manage them, we talk about sort of the risk to violating compliance regulations or even the law, right? So many of you are representing, a diverse industry set on this particular webinar, and you all have your own compliance pieces. If you're part of the railroad, if you're part of the healthcare industry, the airline industry, manufacturing, there's things that you have to do in order to secure funding from federal government, to stay in business locally, and those are all those compliance pieces, and so we always want to make sure that we're in tune to those. There's also risk of privacy of information, privacy of proprietary information, and what are we doing with that, and how are we maintaining that? We also have levels of security, and it's literally physical security, security of information, and security of people perhaps taking our items. And so we want to be looking at what are those risks and what are we doing about them. Crisis management, what do we do in a crisis? So yesterday, as I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, heard, they're calling it a terrorist attack by a gentleman in New York City who took his truck and ran over and killed 8 people, among others that were severely wounded. And it happened to be right by a school. And so the question that would certainly be asked from a crisis management standpoint is, what did that school have in place to get the students who were leaving class and the faculty and the administrators to make sure that they're safe? Because it really happened right at the time, at least that's what the reporting is, the people were getting out of school. So good crisis management is, what do we do now as this is happening? And then business continuity is, what do we do to continue making sure our business runs? So what are the risks that could stop our business? I worked for a company once where it was a software company, and we provided software that basically helped run commercial time on the radio stations throughout the world, actually. And when our software didn't work, their commercials could not play, and they would lose money every 30 seconds, every 60 seconds. So what was an option B that we worked with our clients, that if there was a problem with the software, how could they manually insert these commercials and not lose money? So those are the things that as you can see, as I just used in that last example, what are the risks, and then what are our plan to address those different risks in these different categories. I'd encourage all of you to insert any one of these sort of bolded words here, security, crisis management, and go back to your own offices and say, what have we done to assure the mitigation of this risk? This slide focuses us on really a different way of looking at the verticals of risk within the organization, and it's about health and it's about security and safety. I mean, that's another way of sort of breaking it down. What are we doing to make sure that our people remain healthy? I have many clients who are in manufacturing, and those of you who are yourself know that you walk into almost any manufacturing environment, and before you walk onto the floor, there's earplugs right outside the doors, there's goggles, there's all the things you need to do to make sure that someone isn't going to be permanently injured. And then on the right hand side, when we talk about security and safety, it's making sure that things aren't stolen, making sure that the property is safe from people walking in and causing harm, and then of course anything that we proprietarily own. And so a lot of times organizations will have full-time employees who either focus on health management or security and safety, though sometimes they'll be managing it together. Just to kind of get a state of our state in this room, if you manage health or security and safety management, go ahead and put a yes or a thumbs up in your chat feature. Let's see if we've got any people online who this is a part or all of their job. Okay, so we're getting a couple. Okay, quite a few of you, as a matter of fact. Wonderful. It's interesting, as we're getting a lot of these yeses here, is human resources is really becoming more and more tasked with overseeing what we're looking at this function. It would not surprise me if 5 years from now the exam has a higher percentage of questions and weight from the questions that speak to certification, because we often are the ones most equipped to assess and to plan and to train and to address these items. So for those of you who wrote yes, the good news is I think you'll find from the certification standpoint, the questions will be pretty straightforward, and if you really do have sort of a generalist approach to health and security and safety management, you should feel pretty good about answering the questions on the certification exam. One of the things that comes up in health and safety are complaints, and so this is something that we should really consider. If it's a complaint about a potential risk, for example, if it's a complaint about what something someone did or didn't do that perhaps caused harm to somebody. And so it's important that whenever we're addressing complaints, and this also could off-ramp to truly disciplinary items and things like that, but as we're addressing it here in health and safety, there's a couple of key things they want to make sure we think about is who is most adept to investigate. And often we think it's HR, but not always. Depending if it's truly a safety or health management piece, and maybe we have somebody more equipped on site. Again, I think in manufacturing plants, pharmaceuticals, they often have people who that's their full-time gig of understanding how to address health and safety. And so sometimes they're the ones who are tasked with investigating when there's breaches. Maybe you bring someone from the outside periodically. You could even bring someone from OSHA in to help investigate if you want, though I know a lot of you would be like, we don't want to bring them in unless we have to. In the middle step here, it talks about some investigation steps. And so this would work in any kind of investigation, whether it be of a health or safety, bump in the road, or just a general harassment complaint. Think about how you're going to approach it. Always talk to the person making the complaint first, right? Get as much information out of them as you can. Ask them if there's anyone else that they think that you should talk to. Interview them and other witnesses. And then if there's somebody accused, right, somebody who breached. So there was a organization, it was a manufacturing where they manufactured food products, and this particular employee went in without all of the protective equipment, as well as the netting for the hair. You know, they wear it's not even netting; it's really sort of a cap. And so you have to investigate that, because you have to address all of the food that went through that person in their non clothed, capped manner could have tainted any of the food products. And then you determine, what's the ultimate, true story, based on multiple viewpoints, and then take appropriate action, right? And this should happen very quickly. It should happen, within a matter of 24 to 48 hours, depending on the nature of a complaint. These should not be dragged out for an extended period of time. On the right-hand side, we have here something that you've already seen twice in your area, but we're coming back to it again, is one of the things that helps us investigate is thinking about those things like our job analysis and job document, which talks about what is expected of the job, what is expected of the people in the roles. And so, it's easier to go to somebody and say, it is your job to be properly covered head to toe when you walk into the plant floor, and you weren't. And so making sure that we start to recognize, as we're wrapping up your 6 functional areas, that things truly are connected. So when you're reading a question on your certification exam, try not to say, oh, this must be from employee and labor relations, or this must be from risk management, but rather, this is from the body of HR knowledge. As a total knowledge base, how should I act? What should I do? So OSHA inspection priorities, I definitely would want you to know this. When I've spoken to students like yourself who have finished the course and taken the certification exam, many of them remember there being a question or two around the different types of inspections that OSHA does. So I definitely would want you to recognize these, and really almost recognize them in the order they're listed, because that's what we mean by priority. What's going to bring OSHA in to do an inspection sooner rather than later? And we start with this imminent danger. And so if someone reports to OSHA that, I think if we don't do something quick, someone will be seriously injured or killed, possibly, that's going to really put the red flags into OSHA and get them out there pretty quick. After that comes the severe injury or illness. And so people often wonder, well, why would we not go out first for injury, then for imminent danger? Well, severe injury has, by definition, already happened. Imminent danger could happen. So while we don't want things to happen again, we would want to come out and investigate severe injuries. We certainly would rather prevent another injury, aka imminent danger, than investigate why something already happened. And I think that's an important nuance for your exam. Workers can call and complain. They can do it anonymously, though there's less weight to anonymous complaints, but they can certainly reach out to OSHA, and if OSHA has a trend of complaints or one that's pretty serious, they might come out. Referrals. A referral could be from someone like ComEd or Exelon coming in and doing some work, and they see something that's a problem, and they reach out to OSHA directly. Targeted inspections, very often OSHA will select industries to focus on through the years. They don't necessarily announce them to the public, but then what they do is basically work to do when there aren't other things coming in. So in between imminent danger and injuries and complaints, they'll come in and do these targeted inspections. And then follow-up inspections. Once OSHA's been in and has maybe cited the organization with something, it's not uncommon for them to come back and make sure you have followed up and done what they've asked you to do. So once again, this is a slide I would want you to know for your certification exam, kind of the which has more weight from a priority standpoint, because it would not be a surprise to have a test question around, a scenario, and then like which is going to drive OSHA in sooner rather than later. Okay, we've got our first question here. And while OSHA doesn't often, necessarily go to these top violations, they do have some pretty significant violations possibilities. So go ahead and type in your answer here. What do you think? A, B, C, or D? What's the fine for willful OSHA violations? And as you're answering that, I'm going to give you a clue or two, and some of you might change your mind then. Willful means we intended to violate. We didn't care, or we intentionally put you at risk. So there was the example, a couple of years ago about the woman trainer at SeaWorld who ended up being killed by the killer whale. It grabbed onto her ponytail and dragged her under and drowned her and things like that. Well, that's the story. You can read the OSHA answers to kind of what they didn't think that was a willful violation. They thought it was a serious violation. But let's say OSHA had come in years ago to just general SeaWorld type water parks, not even SeaWorld, and said, we think it's absolutely a high hazard risk for men or women to have flowing ponytails when they're training the whales. Let's say they made that very clear. Then let's say a SeaWorld type company, this is now a scenario, this isn't a true SeaWorld story, but said, you know what, we think our trainers look better with long hair and a ponytail. It's more appealing to the consumers who are coming to watch the shows. So we don't care that it's a risk. We want you to wear those ponytails. If they had done that, that would be willful, right? So that's a long way to say, so knowing that, folks, if something's willful and OSHA determines it's willful, up to infers possibly $0 or $5. Well, we often know if someone's intentionally doing something, there's likely going to be some sort of fine. And so that would, yeah, some of you are coming back, that would be A as in Apple, 5,000 to 70,000. In other words, if we investigate and you willfully did something, violated something, you're going to pay the minimal as 5,000 K. It's just a way to cause a pain point to a business to say, don't do it. Okay, technology. We see technology as a theme through this course, certainly when it comes to safety in the workplace as it relates to technology. We definitely want to give some consideration to, where's the potential risks and what are we doing about it. So certainly, we've gone to electric files for so many things, customer information, employee personnel files, which is great, right? Because it makes accessing information for us much more easy. It makes distributing information easier. But the problem with the electric side is, it's still open to somebody, technologically wise, getting into our systems and accessing, private information. So what are we doing to prevent that? But we also still can't forget the manual stuff. I had a client once that had all of their first floor flood out one day, and all of their personnel files were destroyed. And they unfortunately didn't have a great backup. And so what do you do at that point in time? I had another client that had a part of their business flood out. Unfortunately, like 2 weeks earlier, they had just made copies and put everything online of their personnel files, so they were okay. So what are we doing? Because losing that information, it's one thing to lose it, it's another to have someone take it. So are we making sure we're giving that some consideration? HRIS, Human Resource Information Systems, this is those technology tools that we HR people do to track really everyone from candidates to employees to departed employees. For those of you who are considering a career shift but want to remain in human resources, I will continue to tell you, get into HRIS if you like technology, if you like data. Your jobs will never go away, and they pay a lot of money. So I know some of you probably do that now. Some of you are thinking about it, but it's definitely something to consider. But either way, whether or not you're officially the HRIS guru on site, making sure that the information access is pretty secure. Because what we've learned, and many of you hear these stories all the time, that it's really two pieces of protected information that can cause a problem. Is it a last name and a social security number? Is it a social security number and a birth date? I mean, and we have all of that on our employees typically, so what are we doing to protect our people? E-learning is a great thing, having all of these web-based trainings available, but anytime you have people dialing in from around the country, if not around the world, or even at their desks on site, it makes it easier portal to access from people who have nefarious intent. So just making sure we consider that. And then the same thing goes with our applicant tracking systems. They make life so much easier for us if we have them, how to track those people who want to work with us. But it does mean that people from all over could use that as a portal of entry, let alone what are we doing with that information we collect. If I collect all this new information on people that don't end up working here, how do I make sure someone down the line doesn't have access to it? All right, we've got another question for you to answer here. If corporate espionage occurs, what organizational assets are affected? Go ahead and answer this one for me, please. All right, looks like we're almost all there. We got a kind of across the board here. The answer here that the academic is going for is the D is in David. Okay, they're not including the human here. So when you think about four main organization asset types, there are four. There's the financial, which are cash, inventory, securities. There's physical assets, which are things like the buildings, machines in the buildings, equipment, company vehicles. You have your information assets, which is employee data, customer data, things like that. And then you have your human asset, which are your employees. And the reason it's not human on this one, corporate espionage, is the idea is we're taking access. Espionage is, basically spying, sort of layman's term, and it can be a problem. It can impact money. It can impact, access to a facility. It can impact what are we doing with the information found. But they really mean, from a human standpoint, is somebody going to be physically harmed? And the answer here would be likely not. Now, you and I could make an argument with, if this, then this, and this, but that's what they really mean is what are immediately sort of impacted and affected. And so the human would be, they're not looking at it. But I would agree. I think that's a tougher one to get through. I understand why it doesn't include human, because they're not literally being harmed, but certainly as a side effect on the line, possibly. All right. Risk management techniques. I do want you to know this one, folks, and I'm just going to give you some definitions. These are straight from your materials, but when we talk about risk management, it talks about, okay, as I started the session, we know there's going to be risk. What are we going to do about it? How are we going to address it? Are we going to address it? So risk avoidance. Risk avoidance. Eliminate the risk at any cost. Eliminate the risk at any cost. So maybe we won't take on this new project because we don't want to risk losing money. Loss control. Reduce the number of occasions that loss occurs. So we're not saying it's going to completely go away, but we're going to reduce the number of times that things happen. For those of you who have ever worked in retail, loss control is often what they call their security department. It's for shoplifters and things, because things are often stolen, but we don't think we can ever completely eliminate it, but we can reduce that. Risk retention. Typically I'm just going to stop this. For those of you who have not attended before, I'm kind of glancing on the side. Typically, those people who are having audio issues are the people who call in and are not internet-based. So what we recommend is to, okay, they're addressing it for all of you right now. There we go. So they've just kind of let you know that may be a better way to do it. I think the phone lines, as they get overwhelmed, sometimes that goes in and out. So sorry some of you are dealing with that, and thank you to my bench prep peers for putting that in as well. All right, try and focus here, folks. I'm telling you, you want to know these definitions. Risk retention, typically under self-insured plans. So if we're a self-insurer for health plans, for example, we have a reserve fund to pay for any loss. So risk retention just simply means it's not going to break us if and when something happens. So in security, it could be we know we're going to have $30,000 worth of laptops stolen every year. So we put aside $30,000 cash to replace those, or maybe we take insurance, stronger insurance to cover that loss. But not to be confused with risk transfer, which is truly insuring very specific particular loss. So I'm going to say these one more time because many of you probably were sort of reading the chat, or maybe you were going in and out. So I think that it's important that I say these one more time for all of you. So here we go, folks. Don't say I didn't warn you to know these. Risk avoidance, eliminate the risk at any cost. Loss control, reduce the number of occasions that loss occurs. Risk retention, typically these are under your self-insured plans. They have a reserve fund to pay for any loss. And risk transfer, insuring against a particular loss. So that way it moves the liability from the employer to an insurance company. Make sure you know those, folks. Alrighty, so here, a couple of things you want to keep in mind when we're talking about preventions of different hazards and stuff like that. How can we measure if that's working? What are we doing? And so on the left-hand side of this slide talks about have disciplinary system. Tell people you don't wear your earplugs on the floor, you're going to get written up. You could get fired. Emergency procedures, going ahead and practicing what do we do if this, then this. It's kind of like why you all hear on Tuesdays in certain parts of the Chicagoland area, they do those sirens. You know, what do we do if we're being attacked? A siren will go off. Well, if we don't practice these kind of things, so people are sort of prepared, oh, I know what I'm supposed to do. Making sure that we're taking care of our products and our machinery and things that could go wrong. Let's do preventative maintenance before they break down, and you know, kind of always assume. For those of you who have ever lived in a condo, the predictive maintenance are things like, well, we know in 20 years roofs typically need to be replaced. So let's plan accordingly so when we get to 20 years, we've got the money to pay for it. And then, of course, really good record keeping. Record keeping helps us track trends. That's test worthy. That's why you do record keeping. But it also holds accountable. If we know we're going to report to someone somewhere about record keep, you know, kind of injuries, for example, under OSHA, then we're more likely to be conscious of, oh, I don't want that to get out. Universities have to report incidences of violence and sexual assaults and things like that. Almost all universities fall under that. And I can tell you, once record keeping began, it really did sort of step up efforts of many colleges and universities to try and reduce those, because one, they could track trends, but two, they knew they would possibly lose future students if they had higher levels of incidents on campus. On the right-hand side, we have your general health practices, and what this just has us think about is in the workplace, you know, we kind of categorize things like, where do some of these injuries as a result of health come? And, you know, dust in the workplace, breathing. It's why employees often will ask for an air control assessment, because is it unhealthy? I worked at a company once where people insisted the air was unhealthy for them, and so we twice in a 2-year time brought an outside firm to come in, and the air quality was just fine. But you know, once one person hears there's air quality issues, you know, you got to investigate in case there are. Electric and gas hazards, making sure that, you know, things are put together right. I actually worked at a place once in a restaurant. They came and pulled out the gas stove to do some work, and the person said that at any given time this could have blown up because it wasn't connected correctly. So had this preventative maintenance for something else where they had to move the gas stove happen, it could have been disastrous, you know, killed people. Noise, you know, I've mentioned that with earplugs. Moisture, you know, because moisture often leads to mold leads to health issues. Temperature, I just have to say, from a temperature standpoint, we all know nobody's ever happy it's too hot, it's too cold, but they're really talking about, is it the kind of temperature that you work in a food industry that could cause the food to go spoil and make people sick? And then ergonomics is when you talk about having things set up in a way in sort of your physical spaces to help prevent or reduce injuries. Is your screen close enough to where your eyes are? Is your chair high enough? Is your desk low enough? Those kind of things. And making sure that we as employers, we're typically required to provide protective gear if the job that they're doing warrants it. There are some exceptions to that. And then this last one, I do want to focus on for a moment, this control of hazardous energy, because it has been a test-worthy one. Control of hazardous energy is what we call sort of this lockout, tagout concept. I think some of you probably are very familiar with this. But what that means is when there's machineries and there's access to things that have electric going through it, you have to do, anytime you're doing any work or there's a problem, we have to do what's called this lockout, that people can't by accident turn on a piece of machinery. And then the tag out piece is where who's the responsible party for this, right? So maintenance, this is closed down, Bob and maintenance is working on this. And so it's very specific then until Bob and maintenance unlocks this and untags it, you should stay away. This is such a big deal. I have had students almost every semester tell me horror stories. Last semester I had someone tell me in the week we were going over this, they had a person at their plant go to work on a piece of machinery that was not properly locked and tagged out, though it was malfunctioning, and they went and they were fixing around on something and someone else turned it on. It wasn't even supposed to be on. It was supposed to be unable to be turned on, and they had their hand cut off. That's how typical, the potential risk to this is. All right, a couple of more things here in our about 10 minutes. We're going to jump over to any questions you have about this, or like I said, I'm willing to address other, prep questions that you might have in general, and Katie's going to answer any product questions. This return to work policy is something that certification seems to typically want us to know. Not only does it deal with OSHA, but it also deals with the American with Disabilities Act. And what we're really learn here is this concept of modified duty. What that means is, as an employer, particularly if someone gets injured on the job, but we're even now looking at off the job, that we really do need to consider what would it take to get people back soon as possible without necessarily causing re-injury. And so this modified duty assignment is saying that if somebody left for a workers' comp, we have the right as an employer to work with them and their physicians to say, what can they do? Because we'd much rather pay people someone, even if it's at $80,000, their director level position, we'd much rather pay them to come in and answer phones or file paperwork rather than be at home not doing anything for us. So as soon as they're able to do some work, our job is to really consider modified duty. And what many of you probably have found is some employees don't want it, right? They'd rather stay full unemployed because they're getting typically they're getting some sort of income replacement. But if it's an injury from outside of the job, this is where employees will come and say, I don't have any short-term disability, I'd like to come back. And we as employers really do need to consider what that might be. And modified duty might be half time, bring them in for 4 hours versus 8 hours because they're not physically equipped. We have the right to ask for doctor's notes, even as simple as when someone leaves they broke a leg or something. We have a right to say, before you come back in, we just need to make sure that you're physically able to do your job again. Reasonable accommodation, you should all remember from a previous functional area. It talks about, what would be something we could do to allow people to still do their job with some sort of modification. Maybe it is sitting versus standing all the time, as example. Fit for duty is the concept of, are you fundamentally physically able to do the job at hand. Those are what we call fit for duty physicals. Employers do them all the time. So we're not asking about your lungs and your blood and all that sort of stuff. Just here's what the job requires you to do. Are you fit to do it? And that last line there, good business to pay people, I already spoke to that, which is, as a business, we want people, if we're paying them money, we want them on-site working rather than off-site, not working, but still being paid. I mentioned this at the beginning of the presentation. It should be a reminder to all of us, this concept of emergency response plans and business continuity. So let's say hurricane's coming. What do we do to prepare for that, right? What do we do if we need to evacuate people? What do we do, just to make sure that we're ready? But also, what do we do to try and get our business running or up and running sooner rather than later? So our job as HR professionals is to always have a plan, the active shooter. Of course, we're going to close our building. As a matter of fact, today, driving into DePaul, which is where I'm sitting today, there was a call for one of the schools, I think it was a high school in the suburbs today, that had to shut down. They went emergency response with an active shooter. They thought, not an active shooter, somebody with a gun, that's what it was. And they investigated and it wasn't, but they knew how to go into lockdown right away. But how do you make sure then you can get the school going or the business going? And so our job in HR is to really consider both of those at all times. Drug testing, I definitely want you to keep in mind the big red bold there. Drug testing's fine, folks. There's nothing illegal about drug testing your employees. A couple of things you want to remember. Pre-hire, you want to drug test once you've made an offer. To just drug test all of your candidates typically is not accepted, typically would not be something that could be defensible. But once you've said, we're pretty certain we'd like you to come on board, we need to make sure you're drug-free. Then post-hire, doing anything from random, reasonable suspicion, they're walking around, talking to themselves after an accident, perfectly okay, as long as we're consistent in our approach. I had somebody in one of my classes this semester say that their CEO heard through the grapevine that Bob is a drug addict, and so go test Bob. Well, we have no reasonable suspicion on the job, like he's not doing or saying anything, he wasn't in an accident, and so he said, no, put it under our random testing. Well, that's not random, folks, so you have to be careful to not violate that. And that's really what this avoid targeted drug testing is. My Bob story, don't do it. That's where you're going to pay lots of money to get out of that. Okay, on this side here, there's just a couple of things to think about. This is about the Facebooks, the Twitters, the blogging that we do in business and that our employees have access to or our employees post to. You just want to really consider what are your rules and regulations around them. The one thing I want to focus on is social engineering of this particular slide. Social engineering is when our social networking tools, let's just say Facebook or Twitter of the world, are used against us. So one could say the Russia investigation right now with Facebook and how Russia used Facebook ads to get people to do things or not do things as it comes to voting is a concept of social engineering. So in the workplace, are people getting Twitter email messages and thinking, well, it's from our business email account, I should respond to it, when indeed it's some sort of virus or something that is not truly from us. So be cautious. But I would want you to know that concept of social engineering. It's using kind of all of our different type of social networking tools to get people to do something or not do something, or to maybe get a virus in because they act on something they saw in that social tool. All right, in our last 3 or 4 minutes, we want to talk about 1 or 2 laws here. As a reminder, these are federal laws in the exam, so try and let go of your knowledge of state or local law, and also let go of anything that's happened in the last 6 months to 12 months, because typically that would be too soon to have a question that actually counts towards your score, because those questions would first need to be vetted for reliability and validity. We've already mentioned OSHA. Once again, OSHA is the sort of safety, security, health management law, and this is one that really focuses on general duty. This is one that says we have to report, incidents and injuries and track those, and make sure employees know what their rights are. So it's a pretty important law. Just as a reminder, OSHA can come in and investigate our businesses almost at any time. However, we do have the legal right to ask for a search warrant. It's not recommended, folks, but OSHA can't just come in without a legal reason, and if we're not sure what that legal reason is, we can ask them to have a search warrant. All right, well, our last question here. Under the Drug-Free Workplace Act, employee must notify the employer of any criminal offense in the workplace within. And we don't often have to know a lot of how many days this, how many days that, but I think this is one I would want you to know. All right, the answer is D, David, 5 days. And what I want everybody to remember about this, and we're going to go to the Drug-Free Workplace Act, is this is the law that if you receive federal funds from the government, you are considered a drug-free workplace responsible party, and so we are responsible for making sure that we have training on how to stay drug-free. We have disciplinary action if people come in under the influence. It doesn't say we'll never have a person under the influence or on drugs in the workplace, but it says we have a well-communicated, well-established plan on what to do about it. And as this question back here states, if there's a drug offense that occurs in the workplace, somebody is selling drugs, for example, then the workplace must report that within 5 days, as well the employee. So if the employee, which is how it's more commonly used, if the employee gets the question is between arrested and convicted. It's typically arrested. So you get arrested of selling, marijuana, you would have to notify your employer. A lawyer might say, but it hasn't been a conviction yet. For your exam, just focus on the 5-day notification. Both the employee to the employer, or the employer has a reporting process as well to the federal government. And then we're about ready to answer any questions you have, so feel free to start typing those in, as I just mentioned this last law here, which is the Needle Stick Safety and Prevention Act. For any situation where there will be needles, obviously healthcare, but there could also be, diabetic needles. There could be, a variety of different needles in the workplace situation. The employer is responsible to make sure that there's a receptacle, your sharps containers, as far as where those needles can go, so that they don't go into regular garbage bags and harm anyone. And it's our job to make sure that those are well placed, well accessed, and then when they're full, gotten rid of. And so just make sure that it's our job as employers, if there's something to do with needles in the workplace, that we've got a solution to the disposal of those needles. All right, at this time, Katie and I are prepared to answer some questions. I'm going to first answer any that you have about this functional area, but also if you've got any general ones on prepping for the exam, I'm more than happy to address those as well. And then Katie will address any that speak to the product. So, okay, I'm going to get I have to sort of scroll back myself, so just give me a moment. Is stop-loss insurance an instance of risk? I'm trying to read your question here, risk retention or risk transfer. You know what, Erica, I think for your exam, I don't think they would go that detailed, because it is almost one of those sort of philosophical questions. Where does it fall? Who cares as long as it falls, you know, as long as you consider it. But if I were to truly think about where I would put stop loss insurance, I would call that a true risk transfer. So because risk transfer really focuses more on having a third party insurer cover. So whereas risk retention is when we actually maybe have money set aside. So in both of your examples there, Erica, I would likely put it under risk transfer. If we put a bag of cash underneath the CEO's desk for any sort of stop loss issues, then I'd say that would be risk retention. And then this one is asking me LF, I'm not sure. The definitions, I'm assuming you're likely talking about the ones that I was just talking about the second again. So I'm going to repeat risk avoidance, loss control, risk retention, risk transfer one more time. LF, if that's not what you were asking, then go ahead and type in and I'll address that as well. But for what it's worth, folks, this is all straight from your book too, so you can find your learning system rather. Risk avoidance, so these are managing risk approaches. Risk avoidance is eliminate the risk at any cost, so don't do it, for example. Loss control, reduce the number of occasions that loss occurs. So we're kind of recognizing it's not going to go away, but we're going to do everything we can to reduce the chance of things happening, the amount of them. Risk retention, this is primarily under self-insured type plans. We have a reserve fund to pay for any loss, and then risk transfer, insuring against a particular loss, will move the liability from the employer to an insurance carrier or a third party. Okay, wonderful. And then I'm going to go back up because as people type in, my screen goes as well. So let me kind of make sure I catch everything. Workplace violence. How do you train in a plan when the potentially violent employee will be learning the safety plan too? Pete, that is another great philosophical question, and I wish we had a half hour for us all to talk about that. I think it's a wonderful question. I don't know that there's an academic answer to it. I'll give you my initial professional gut. I so wish we could all talk about Pete's question. How do you train when the violent employee will learning the safety plan? Well, I think what we have to recognize is that our safety plan is one that even if somebody knows it, right, we can be protected from them. So, the example I can think about is when we know there's an active shooter on site, and let's say it is an employee who knows our plan, we are told to go into rooms, offices, lock the doors, and don't open them for anybody but the police and be verified it's the police. So even if that employee knew, I bet there's people hiding in there, if our people were well trained, even if it's Bob outside saying, it's Bob, let me in, we have trained our people enough to know at a certain point when we're in lockdown, nobody gets in, even if it's Bob, because Bob might be the shooter. But honestly, Pete, I think it's a great question. I think that I'm actually going to note to self the next time I'm talking to like a police officer who does these safety things with me, I'm going to ask him that question for you, Pete, because it's a great one. Samar, if I'm saying your name correctly, what are your tips for SPHR prep? So if you mean in specific to the more senior side of it versus the PHR, I think, Samar, there's a couple of things. Periodically in your lessons, we point out things or questions that are more senior. Certainly focus on those. But I think generally speaking, the senior side has to know all the facts, but they have to be strategic about their behaviors and their actions. So anytime you see materials or questions that focuses on long-term planning, strategic planning, succession planning, forecasting, finance for the future, anything that really focuses much more on the strategic initiatives, the long-term planning to keep a business going, pay special attention to those. So my recommendation would be know everything we're asking the PHR people to do, but then also think, can you take it to the next step? How does that speak to a strategy of a business? Why would having a good PTO plan make sense strategically for a business? You're going to avoid burnout, for example. So I think those are some things I would, on a shorthand, have you consider. Pete, what evidence is needed to search property? If you mean in regarding to OSHA, which I can only assume you do because that's what we're talking about here, you know, a known accident, for example, would be good enough. A legitimate source would probably be good enough. So could OSHA come in because of an anonymous complaint? No. Could OSHA come in because Bob in accounting says, here's what's going on? Those are the kind of things that typically is what OSHA would need to provide if challenged. I will tell you, in real world, they're almost never challenged because I always like to joke, it's like telling the tax man who's come to do an audit, can you wait while I put this money of cash underneath my bed? Even though they're supposed to be objective, being kind of held off would often, you know, people are human who are even work for OSHA, but fundamentally, you know, some sort of legitimate source, legitimate complaint, legitimate known accident would be likely enough. Okay, and then so, Amy, a couple of things. First of all, I'm not sure why there's a difference between the 5 and the 10 days. What's possibly would happen is there's been a recent update. If there is one way or the other, it likely would not show on the exam. I'm responding to Amy's question about the 5 days or the 10 days. I don't think that would be my extreme worry point. If you can perhaps point out to bench prep where you've seen two different things, then between bench prep and they can even throw it my way, we can investigate and do a post if there truly is a difference, which there could be, Amy, because in 2000 plus questions and, you know, a couple of these core sources, sometimes there are some differences, sometimes laws have changed, but fundamentally you are also asking generally Drug-Free Workplace Act says it's our job to make sure we train, we inform, we have reporting processes, we have policies, we have disciplinary action, and the violation is somebody violates something, they come in and they're shooting up drugs in the workplace, for the example. What do we do with that information? But really how the law means to interpret it is you as an employee are meant to be drug-free. So if you're caught in your life doing something that would put our employer at risk for being drug-free, aka you're caught smuggling marijuana, you have to report that so we know we can be in tune and help make sure, is there a chance that this person, if they're dealing drugs, are they on drugs? So it's much more of a, doesn't mean someone will lose their job. It just simply means that if there's a violation, it means there's been a problem on site or off site that the employer has to be aware of to make sure we are not putting any of our employees who are funded in part by this federal contract at risk, or any customers or fellow employees. There's a question on, do we recommend practice quizzes? Oh my gosh, folks, take as many quizzes, as many questions, as many practices as you possibly can. Just make sure you're getting them from reliable sources. You've got over 2,000 through bench prep, but if you go outside, you know, there's a bunch of there's a bunch of phone applications that have additional questions. I don't think bench prep, and I representing bench prep would say don't look at those, but just make sure you do your research online to make sure that you're getting them from a good, valid, and reliable source. But I think questions. Do I have any study tips for HR professionals that specialize in one aspect of HR? Another really good question, Julie. I think that I think any of you who are focusing on, you know, the generalist world now, but you only specialize in safety, for example, I think there's a couple of things I would do. I would definitely maximize the utilization of the bench prep tools, take the questions from the different lessons, play the games which address these, all those great things, and Katie may add to this as she closes in a moment. But what I would also do is I would real world it. If you're currently at an employer and you're a specialist and you want exposure to the others, I would take some of the moments, some of the questions that maybe you struggle with a bit more, and walk yourself over and talk to your peers in your department, at your company, or maybe even some of your bench prep peers here, and really try and get some real world experience so that you can talk it through and it goes from being this abstract academic thing to the aha moment. So that would be a couple of thoughts there. And then let me see here. So maybe what we're hearing here is that maybe there's a difference between sort of the employee piece and the employer piece in the days. We'll do some research on that as well, and if we find that there's some conflict, we'll do some posting on that. So it looks like someone's typed for all of you some notes. I'll let you read through that as well. Because of the conviction here. And then, yeah, it looks like Pete has given us some information. I have no reason to doubt Pete's piece. So I think for now, we'll kind of focus on that. And I know we're hitting our 1 o'clock, and I know Katie wants to take it and wrap, but these are great questions. So at this point in time, Katie, why don't you go ahead? I know we're right at our bewitching hour. I haven't seen any specific product questions, but we'll let anyone ask that as well. And then it looks like some people are giving us, hey, peer-to-peer, thanks to everybody. I think they're giving us some good additional info on that as well. But Katie, why don't you take it if you would?
Thank you so much, John. I know we are at time, so if you need to drop off, feel free to do so. But I can still take a couple of minutes to answer any product or tech questions that anyone might have. I'll just wait a minute or two to see if anybody has any outstanding questions for us. All right, I will keep my eyes on the chat feature, but it looks like we don't have any tech questions today. So I'd just like to thank you all again for joining the webinar today. We do appreciate all of your participation. As another reminder, here is our webinar schedule for the rest of this year. Just to note, we do have a webinar next week with Cornelia Gamlin on organizational culture and employee relations. And then we will also have a webinar the week after that on November 15th on termination and downsizing with Barbara Mitchell. So we do encourage you to register for those webinars and attend them. And as always, good luck with your studies, and we will see you again soon. Thank you.